Hello, I'm Linda Russell, and we are looking at a review of Chapter 5 on the developing learning activities and techniques. You can take a look at these. These are just some questions that people wonder about shifting from a predominant lecture format to a more active learning kind of format. And if we're not familiar with this, honestly, there's lots of things to learn here. So we'll try to address most of these points. Activities do take time. Absolutely. They take more time than you just saying something. So building that kind of time in and making sure you feel that it's worth the time it means you have to select appropriately. Sometimes in asynchronous type formats, making sure your instructions are really clear is a little bit of a learning curve for everybody. And so really clear directions, giving students that practice so that they know what to expect from you, that's important. Here's some concerns. Faculty say this all the time. Students don't prepare for class. If I don't lecture, then how are they ever going to learn anything? Because they don't read and they come to class just sort of like passive. Well, you don't know that for sure. You do know that some people don't come to class prepared, but there are plenty of people that come relatively prepared and maybe they're quiet about it. Maybe they just are ready and you don't realize that they are. Sometimes students do act like they want to be spoon-fed. Just tell me what I need to know and then I'll know what's on the test. And you know, the answer to that is this is how learning works. You have to do things. Your head is not empty and I don't open it up and pour things in. So I'm going to use a different approach and you'll adapt. Using information in your course that in the workplace doesn't work that way. We don't ever get lectures at work. That is not how it works. So learning how to use the skills that employers say are important, which we spoke about for Chapter 4, are the things that students will be expected to have experience and some competence in, and sitting passively in the class is just not it. So we have some responsibility that we have trained them to be passive. Not we personally, but the educational system. And some other resistance sometimes happens, and students want to be passive. Many of them would like to be passive. And so we just have to be ready to say, here's what employers tell us we really need to work on so that you're going to be successful in your job at some point when you get there, or maybe even in your current job for students who work and go to school, which are many. Another issue has to do with classroom management. If it's a face-to-face class, handling students that might be all talking at once in different groups or might be moving around the room is a new skill to develop how to manage that for many college teachers. And you just have to have some signals and some rules and some timer things and things that can help people kind of come back together and be ready to move to the next thing. In online teaching, it certainly is difficult. I think with COVID, using Zoom and knowing how you need to be muted and so forth is now something that many students already have had lots of experience with. So I think that's gotten easier. Many organizational techniques that you have learned about already with communicating with students are really effective tools in helping set the tone. So checklists, here's where we are in our chapter, here's what we did, here's what's next. Those are all things that help students feel comfortable about engaging so that they don't just walk into the classroom with an empty mind, having no idea what you're going to do that day, when in fact, they should come with some expectation. With activities, this is another thing that seems like a logistical matter, but it does affect you because if you lecture a lot, you're not doing a lot of grading because you're not asking students to do anything that you have to look at. So it seems like you're adding a lot of work to your load. And so we have gathered some tips from a lot of people who have done this. We've all had experience, our author group, where we can have made this manageable for us. So here are a few of those tips. You can design project works or think, pair, share that are little. You do not have to grade these without looking at with any long kind of look at them. They can be very quick. You can use advanced organizers and then students can fill in part of them, and that helps them be more actively engaged in making sense out of the material, and that's a disciplinary literacy skill. You can create rubrics. We're big fans of rubrics because they help keep you more clear yourself about what you're after and more consistent across grading maybe many assignments. Also, the rubrics usually are shared with students when they get the assignment. It helps students check themselves so that they may not make some of the same mistakes that they might have made if they didn't know that they were being graded on. So those can be very helpful, and you can use rubrics with peer assessment if you use that sort of thing. A lot of writing teachers use peer assessment. So a rubric takes some time to set up, absolutely. I will say with artificial intelligence options, you may be able to get a good rubric, at least a start of a rubric put up if you do a little looking. And rubrics have really gained favor in the past, I don't know, 15 years or so. And so you may be able to get some good start, but it would have to be customized for your own work. It does save you time in terms of giving feedback when you can circle or check certain parts of the rubric so students know where it is that they did well and where it is that they lacked something or did something wrong. So it can actually speed up your grading to have a rubric that you don't have to write the same thing all the time to students. Many activities can be very low stakes, where if somebody is there and they're participating in the activity, you know, they get a check mark, or maybe it's a 3-point scale if they, you know, really participated a lot or not so much. It can be really easy to do. And our big tip from our faculty is touch it once, read, grade, record, boom. And then you're done, and you just only look at it that one time. Sometimes these things can even be done if you're in a face-to-face live situation where you're actually checking those things off right on the spot. And then you're done with them. You don't have to go back and look at them anymore. We have some suggested activities in Chapter 5 that you might not be familiar with. And so we'd like to introduce you to some of these things. Using quizzing to help get to deeper learning is kind of novel. You're not using quizzing here as a high stakes assessment. You're using it as a learning tool. So that might even mean that you put 3 questions up and, you know, on a screen, and that students answer them right away. They can even, on the second bullet, they can even answer maybe using an online polling, and then instantly, not only do you know what your students know, but so do they. That's a pretty nice way to check on things as you go. This is formative assessment, but it's very low stake for the students. You can ask students to do things like draw a picture. I think using the smartphones to take photos of various things in your class, whether it's something that's up on a board or in the room or on a screen or whatever, and that they can post that, and that would be an answer or an indicator that they've engaged with the material appropriately. Organizers, whether they are partially completed tables or outlines or diagrams that students fill in the rest. Those can also be submitted online as a visual to initiate discussion, to compare, using Google Slides sometimes, where everybody gets a chance to edit in real time, and then everybody can see what everybody did. That's another way to use those types of things. And again, remember that advanced organizers are your way of sneaking in a little of that disciplinary literacy. Using categories appropriately for the discipline is another disciplinary literacy skills. Most disciplines do have a strong association with categorizing types of things, and it's a way of thinking that is very significant. And it also helps with remembering. It's not just a bunch of random facts, they're actually organized in a certain way. So helping the students, this is scaffolding. Maybe you start at the beginning with something that's partly filled in and they fill in the rest, and maybe by the end of the semester, the students can do their own thing without any prompts. The same with fill in the pathway. Pathway is a way of thinking sometimes in sciences like pathophysiology and physiology, where you're tracking a certain order that happens in the body in a certain way, and these are significant to learning in that context. So some of them could be partially filled in, some of them could be completely empty as you get further on in the semester. What these activities do is they force a student to be more actively engaged in the material rather than just simply listening with one sense or reading with just basically one sense in a more passive interaction. So these are all very easy things to integrate into your work. Some of them can be done outside of class and then submitted. Sometimes these things can be done in a class, during discussion, and so forth. Gallery walks would work. They work in online because you can work in Google Docs, for example. You can use physical gallery walks if you're in a classroom face-to-face, where people actually put things like, this is how it was originally designed, on the wall, and students move around the room looking at what other students have drawn or filled in or discussed, or whatever the task might be. It gets them out of their seat, it gets them talking with each other, and so forth. Four corners is this is an older idea that was designed for a face-to-face classroom where people vote, and maybe there are three positions, and they go to the corner of the room, or four positions, and they literally go to that corner because they agree with that statement. And again, it facilitates discussion, and then you can talk about defending your position and having evidence and reasoning and things like that. Jigsaws are where people break things down into parts, so everybody has a task, and then you come together, and then you have a whole. So this is really nice actually for introverted students, because they get to control what they do, and they have time to do their part and get it right. Sometimes people even break, if you have an A, B, and a C role, you can break up the class and say, okay, all your A's, you get together so you can all be on, on the same page about what you're talking about with your topic, and all the B's, and then they mix it up, and the A, B, C together is the whole group that should cover all aspects of what the assignment was. The more you give students very specific roles, the better group work goes. And many people have tried putting students in groups without much direction, and then it doesn't usually go well, and then they conclude that group work doesn't work. And it just needs to be handled such that everyone has a very specific task, so they know what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to contribute, and then it goes much better. Sometimes student-generated study materials work really well, and they can upload those and share them, or you can use something like Google Docs or Google Slides to share information better. They have to be right. So there has to be some vetting so that students don't generate materials that lead students astray in their class. You don't want that. So again, if you can break something down so that it's likely to be successful, then they can be producing some pretty good things, but it's got to be pretty bite-sized. Making study cards is one of my favorite things, and then they can share their study cards. So I really like the idea that we can ask a lot of different questions about that. So online discussion. So we're talking about introverts and extroverts earlier in the other chapter, and so keep this in mind, that their tendencies are that extroverts would be jumping in to get involved more frequently than introverts. And so we want to set up a discussion such that both of these types of people can be successful and feel like they're contributing and getting something out of the experience. Contrasting a type of activity that often goes in a classroom, where a lecture will involve the instructor saying, let me ask you a question. And so they'll throw out a question and one person will answer. It's usually an extrovert. And then you have the question, well, what are the rest of the people in the class doing? And I'm sure you've had the experience where the extroverted student dominates and everybody else has essentially permission to sit back and do nothing. We don't want that. We want everybody to feel both obligated to participate, but also benefiting from participating. And again, you start that and you don't let somebody dominate, and you set up the situation where everybody needs to be quiet for a little bit, then maybe you have better participation. You can still throw out a question, but perhaps you have everybody jot down an idea and then turn and share it with a partner. Then all of a sudden you've got everybody involved, not just one person, and nobody's sitting passively. Everybody had the opportunity to do that, but nobody had to take a big risk. So those are some ways you can just shift that a little bit. If the class is in groups, often there's one person who's dominating and some people can just sit. you still really wonder. And what we discovered with teaching online is that an online discussion gives everybody a chance to participate according to their own comfort. And they don't have to hurry, and they don't have to respond instantly with their fully formed ideas, and they don't dominate and take everybody else away. So the online discussion format is a really good tool to allowing students to prepare their responses. They get that time. They put people in the position of being in control of their thinking. You get more responses from people, and that diversity of responses allows for much more deeper understanding and discussion. So that is a really interesting thing that for me was an unexpected result of shifting to having these discussions not in person. It made a big difference. And I think that my students felt like, my introverted students in particular really felt more connected. So when you do that kind of online discussion, even if you're teaching a face-to-face class, you can still have an online discussion. You can see really truly how each student is doing without having to do some formal assessment or test or quiz. With this diversity of discussion that you get online, you get much deeper learning possibilities because you get more people putting forth their ideas. It's not just you and one student anymore. It also has some of these other skills that play in that employers expect students to be good at, and those are those communication skills, both in writing and in speaking. Obviously, we're doing the writing one this time, but how to disagree with somebody politely, for example, is a really important skill, and to do it in writing and have some ground rules in your discussion so that you've helped students think about how they might do that. Those are huge, huge job skills. And you get a lot of data because you've got the transcript of your discussion right there. And so if you're really looking at how effective is this course, or in this bottleneck part of the course, or where did students have a line of reasoning that went astray, you've got some data there that later, when you have time, when you're rethinking your course for the next time, that you can actually remember, because you can look at the actual transcript and you can say, oh yeah, that was a problem. I'm going to fix that way I use that question. Designing a course for everybody, is a challenge. We talked about cultural inclusive pedagogy. We think about that quite a bit, but there's another aspect of this, and that is you have a range of student experiences, abilities, and so forth. And they're all in your class. They may all be in your class. And this is particularly true if you teach an introductory type of course. And I have, as a reading and study skills instructor, I've spent a lot of time with students who come out of the developmental or remedial part of the curriculum into the main curriculum. And I've also worked a lot with English language learners. So this section here is going to address some special things when you think about helping these students who have maybe bigger gaps. So when we talk about developmental ed students, I'm going to say that if you never had the experience of really having big gaps in your learning and challenges in your learning, it's hard to know. It's hard to know what in the world is going on. If you were in any kind of program, or if you struggled in your learning in some way, in some subject at some point, you learn your own way. You had trouble in your own way. You had successes in your own way. It's very idiosyncratic. It's hard to generalize. But let's think about these concepts. That whole idea that we have novices moving along a continuum to gain some mastery. Obviously, everybody's not going to become an expert, but we're moving along. That concept is very important. Accessibility is important, whether it's using alt text for pictures and things like that, or checking your readability on materials you develop yourself, or using the tools that Microsoft Word, for example, allows you to use so that a screen reader could work. That type of accessibility is definitely something to consider. And if you haven't considered that yet, take a piece at a time, but it is super important. And it isn't just physical disabilities, it's also about learning disabilities, such as struggling to read. And if a text reader can read because you use titles appropriately and so forth in your documents, then that's going to help that student a lot. There's so many kinds of learning challenges. You can't know them all. You can't become familiar with how to mitigate for those, but you can be aware and you can ask students, tell me what helps you learn best, and they'll know. They will have some ideas. Prior knowledge and culturally laden prior knowledge is significant, and especially if you happen to be in a place where you have students coming to you who grew up in some other country, that there's a huge range of experiences with those students. Some are college degree holders and some have hardly held a pencil. It is really going to be a great thing. You can't become an expert in all of that either, but you can become aware of the possibilities. So here's some things that I'm going to generalize with when I tell you not to generalize. There are some unfortunate experiences that many students who come out of our lower courses in math and reading and writing in particular, where they are deemed as not smart and as not very hardworking. And get away from that. We have an appendix in our book that talks about these things, but here are some things I think we can safely say. They have some degree of less familiarity with the how college works, because they may not have any family people who went to college, so they don't know. And they may have no idea about the actual expectation and load of the work. They may have a lack of background knowledge in some areas, maybe not in others. So the common theme you see is gaps. I know a lot about this, and all of a sudden I know absolutely nothing. They may struggle with some college level vocabulary words. They may have lower reading skills and not as developed strategies for handling lengthy readings, long chapters and so forth. They may have holes in their math skills, again, where they know something fine and then all of a sudden they don't know how to do that anymore. They don't know how to calculate GPA, for example, because they can't remember how to do averages, or, you know, something that is required in your course, certain rules, that kind of thing, or instant recall of things. Many textbooks do things like 20% of Americans, you know, think such and so, but half say such and such. Well, that's shifting from a percent to a fraction. And many of our students do not do that mentally very, very agilely. So they don't immediately see one is bigger, one is smaller, how much bigger, how much smaller, and so forth. Many developmental students do not do well on tests, and they will tell you that frequently. Oh, I never do well on tests. There are a lot of reasons for that. They can get better at it. However, test taking is a separate and distinct skill that can be taught. And they may have educational histories that include a lot of special education, or IEPs, which are individual educational programs, and therefore in college they will not have that separate, and they may be having a little difficulty transitioning into just being in the soup with everybody else. I think it's important, rather than judging, to use this phrase in my head, that this student has not had the opportunity to learn the thing, whatever I'm trying to get them. A lot of these students feel ashamed of themselves. They feel stupid. So if I just approach it that, well, you know, if you're a novice learner, you know where you are. We talked about this. You're at the beginning. You know, you're going to make mistakes. Of course you are. That's the way it always is. So you haven't had the opportunity to learn it. We're going to work on it. It doesn't feel as harsh. Have an expectation that all of your students should, and can have the ability to learn what they need from your course. They will not all get A's, but perhaps they can all get what they need. And you are going to try to be that curator to find the way that they get the experiences and the practice that they need. So you set an expectation that, you know, you can learn this. I have confidence. And then you have to be explicit about your expectations, showing as many exemplars or examples of work as you possibly can. That can come from sample papers or quiz questions or whatever, so that people have models to use. That's really helpful. And again, you're putting those out there for everybody. You're not just giving them to certain students. So here are some other tips about sharing what other students might have said, what their advice other students might write at the end of one semester that you can show the next semester to your students. Try reading your textbook as if you were a student. How would you work with it? Would you take notes on it? What would those look like? That kind of thing. And then you can show your students. And again, you show all your students these things. It doesn't have to take a lot of time, but you're teaching them how to use your disciplinary skills to manage the content, particularly if there are long readings involved. If your course has writing in it, a scoring rubric for writing is really key. And if you can give examples of well done work, that helps. But in writing, a lot of times, because the topic of writing is different, students don't generalize to how that would work to help me on my topic. So a rubric that is talking about providing a certain number of examples or having a strong thesis statement or whatever your requirement is, that is more helpful maybe than looking at other students' papers on other topics. And when you give exams, if you could pull out the items that maybe more students missed, and you could show them, and then you can talk through that test item to help students think through a test question, especially if they're multiple choice questions. This is really a test-taking skill. If somebody doesn't read test questions very well, they have no idea why they got it wrong. Even if sometimes they remembered the actual content, they could still get the question wrong if they don't read carefully. And so by taking a couple of those and discussing, here's why the answer is right, and here's why these other choices are incorrect, even if they're maybe kind of similar, that really helps your students understand how to think when they're taking an exam. And as I said, it's a special skill to take a test, especially an objective test. So you can use a D2L feature or online course management feature. Sometimes there's a why an answer is wrong. And so that can be useful, and I would experiment with that too. Now, English language learners. So this is an interesting, this is just an interesting group. There's all over the place. So there is a philosophy out there that English language learners should not be put into developmental courses with native language students. And the reason is because many times they just are not the same student. Many of them have a knowledge of multiple languages, maybe their English isn't that great, but maybe they speak 2 or 3 other languages, so they have very good skills in language. A lot of our English language learners have other good education or jobs histories and so forth in their home countries, have been displaced for some reason, and now all they need is English. They don't really need to learn how to be a student. They've already done that part, but they need to really, boost their vocabulary and their understanding of the language. So we have to realize that maybe they're really a different kind of student than some of our students who haven't generally had a hard time with school. However, ELL students certainly can be developmental if they have had fewer educational opportunities, if they have had great gaps in their education. There are lots of refugees that have been housed in camps and so forth, where all they get to do is practice math, but they don't get anything else, let's say. And so they're got huge holes in their schooling, and background knowledge may be an issue. So sometimes it's appropriate to place students in with other developmental students if they have essentially similar educational histories. And always ELL students are in the position of lacking culturally laden information. And many times we don't realize how much we crack jokes, or we put little examples in, or we talk about things in context that includes information that only we know because we grew up here. So here's just an example that you can actually help them using your tools online, just to give them a link to something that would fill in the gap, because they just won't know what you're talking about. I had a colleague who used to put little jokes in as multiple choice questions, but all the jokes really required people to have a very sophisticated cultural understanding. And the students would get a joke question wrong, which punished them. And it was supposed to be the opposite. Everybody was supposed to get it right because we all get this. Well, everybody isn't the same. So it's good to think about that. So here, again, this is good for a much broader audience than just ELL students, but terminology that ends up getting used as a general word, like the word theory. If they're in a context, again, this is a disciplinary literacy thing, the word theory in science has a special meaning, and it's maybe different than we throw it around in casual conversation. So it's good, helpful things to be explicit about that if you can just drop that in. Time is huge for both of these groups. It takes longer. It takes longer when the English isn't your first language. It takes longer if you're not a very good reader. Maybe you can figure out a way to allow for some time flexibility. You can give it to everybody, but it's going to help these particular students more. If you can connect with somebody who teaches these students in separate classes, and you can probably learn some things. You can maybe give them here, hey, you know, this is what I'm trying to do in my class. You know, how can I help? How can I help your students the best? I think that if you can get outside your own discipline and work with other people, you're always going to be feeling a lot better. So that is all these strategies that we talk about are in fact really important for those particular students. However, they are super important for everybody. I mean, and they don't hurt everybody, let me put it that way. They make the most difference for the students who are the most needy here. However, they are not bad for anybody else either. And when you integrate them in, they don't seem like special things. They seem like they just seem like regular things. So it makes it easier for everybody and more clear for everybody. So I'd like to thank you for coming today, and hope to see you again in the next activity.